Hey Murphy, it's Mr. Erickson. Today we're gonna take on kind of our last major thing for the year, which is the idea of Reconstruction. We're gonna look at Reconstruction in two parts. This week we're gonna deal with kind of the political aspects of Reconstruction. So we're gonna look at how eventually we got to a specific Reconstruction plan and what that Reconstruction plan kind of looked like. We know with Lincoln's assassination that Reconstruction is going to be different than had Lincoln continued to be president. So we're going to kind of zero in on what sort of Reconstruction we ended up having. That's the goal this week, is to kind of get through that political idea of Reconstruction. And then next week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the end of official Reconstruction, which comes in 1877, and ultimately we're going to deal with sort of the impact of Reconstruction, or how Reconstruction sort of took hold in terms of the rest of the country. Um, One of the things that sometimes you'll hear historians, even to this day, 2020, you'll hear historians talk about the fact that Reconstruction isn't over to this point. That we had a second Reconstruction that sort of deals with all of the issues that came about with the end of our official political Reconstruction. So next week we're going to kind of dig into a little bigger time period, and we're going to start looking at how Reconstruction affected the population, how it affected the population of Northerners, but especially how it affected the population of African Americans living in the South. So that's going to kind of be the goal for us, the thing that we're going to sort of work on. Today, though, I wanted to start with something that is, I think, as a history geek, somewhat interesting. And a lot of times, you hear these conspiracy theories and other things like that. And sometimes we have these things in history that they're just weird. And in terms of your ability to potentially explain them, it kind of becomes a little bit difficult to draw some real specific conclusions about how things sort of line up or what things are like. So we ended last time with the death of Lincoln and his assassination. We have had four presidents who have been assassinated. The first being Lincoln, the last being President Kennedy. Lincoln's assassination after he was elected in 1860, and Kennedy's assassination after he was elected in 1960. Um, one of the things some people don't know about the Lincoln family is that Mary Todd Lincoln was a bit superstitious. She had definitely some things that were maybe a little bit out there, definitely verging on the supernatural and other stuff like that. She was a big believer in astrology. She read her horoscope every day and kind of religiously followed what the horoscope said for her for that particular day. She believed in spirits and ghosts and other things like that. And Abe wasn't much for that sort of stuff, but he was a peacekeeper, and so if Mary Todd wanted to bring in a medium or a psychic or someone with a crystal ball into the White House, Abe kind of just said, okay, I'll go along with it. And there actually were seances held in the White House. So Mary Todd brought in mediums who she thought could speak to the dead. She was constantly trying to contact her dead son Willie and speak to him from beyond the grave, and you would see some signs of that throughout the time in the White House. For Lincoln's part, Lincoln, he didn't really believe in all that, but he did sort of believe in the dreams. And we've had a long history of a lot of our political people having pretty specific dreams. They had the the death dream. Dr. King was famous for kind of knowing or believing that his future was limited, that there was a good chance that he wasn't going to live to be an old age. John Kennedy talked about dying in office, and Lincoln had those. He had those dreams too. He had this one kind of recurring dream where he kind of foresaw his own death. He In his dream he gets up from his bed in the White House, and he begins walking down this hallway, some long hallway, and throughout the course of the dream, as he's walking the hallway, he's hearing the sounds of crying and moaning, and eventually he gets to the end of the hallway, and there's a soldier standing at a doorway, and the soldier is crying, and Lincoln says to him, "Why are you crying, son?" And the soldier says, "The president's been shot." And Lincoln looks into the room beyond the soldier, and he sees himself lying in a coffin. And so Lincoln kind of has this death dream. He also had a dream where he's in a boat in rowing, and he could never quite make it to shore. And some people have kind of connected that to the fact that he would never actually be there to unify the country or bring the country back together again. So the idea of the supernatural and the mystical is an idea that kind of surrounded Lincoln somewhat throughout his time in office. So when we think about our first assassinated president, President Lincoln, and our last assassinated president, President Kennedy, there are this kind of string of sort of coincidences that draw the two together over the course of time. And whether these things are just random coincidences, or whether some people think that maybe there's some extra supernatural force that's bringing these things together, I don't know. I just think that when you think about some of these things, there's kind of a weirdness to it. So I'm going to share some of these connections with you, and hopefully it'll be something that at least sparks a little bit of curiosity. So here they are. Some of the things that have connected our presidents over the course of the fact that they were 100 years apart in terms of service. For instance, here's a coincidence. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. John Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. So there is a 100-year difference between the times that they served in the Congress of the United States. Is that just a coincidence? Maybe. But then add this. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. John Kennedy was elected president in 1960. 100 years separating them. 1860 to 1960. Just a coincidence? Maybe. Then we could add some more things to the pile of coincidences. Both were concerned with civil rights. Lincoln ultimately responsible for helping get the 13th Amendment eventually passed, freeing the slave population and abolishing slavery. President Kennedy in the 1960s working toward issues of equality with blacks and whites. Both had wives who lost children while living in the White House. Mary Todd, her son Willie, died in the White House. Jackie Kennedy, who was President Kennedy's wife, she actually had a child who lived just a couple of days and then died while he was president. Both presidents were shot on a Friday. Both presidents were shot in the head. Both were assassinated by a Southerner. John Wilkes Booth was from Virginia. And Lee Harvey Oswald, who assassinated President Kennedy, was from Texas. Both were succeeded to the presidency by Southerners named Johnson. Think about that. President Lincoln's successor was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee. President Kennedy's successor was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was from Texas. So what do you think the odds are of that? Just a coincidence? I don't know, maybe. So here's some more things that tied the two of them together. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, was born in 1908. 100 years apart. The assassins, John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Lincoln, was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald, who assassinated Kennedy, was born in 1939. 100 years apart. Both assassins were known by their three names. So it's John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald. It wasn't Lee Oswald and John Booth. They went by their middle names. Both of their names have 15 letters. Spooky, right? Now this next one. This is the one that of all of these is the one that we can't 100% prove. Lincoln's secretary was named Kennedy, and Kennedy's secretary was named Lincoln. Now, we know for a fact that Kennedy's personal secretary was named Lincoln. What we don't know is some of the papers seem to indicate there was a point when Lincoln had a secretary whose name was Kennedy. But of all of these, this is the one that is on the most shaky ground. The rest of them, pretty dead on. Lincoln was shot at the theater named Ford. Kennedy was shot in a car called Lincoln, made by Ford. Booth and Oswald were both killed before their trials. We know Booth was shot in a tobacco barn. Oswald was actually shot on his way from court to the jail. He was actually shot on live television. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and was caught in a warehouse. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and was caught in a theater. Come on. Coincidence? Are you kidding me? Oswald shot Kennedy from the book depository building in Dallas, which was a warehouse for books. Ultimately, as a result of the manhunt, he was eventually caught in a movie theater. Lincoln was shot at the Ford Theater. Lincoln was shot at the Ford Theater by Booth, and then Booth was caught in a tobacco drying barn, a warehouse for tobacco. Coincidence. And here's the topper. A week before Lincoln was shot, he was in Monroe, Maryland. A week before Kennedy was shot, he was with Marilyn Monroe. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. So whether you believe in spiritual things or the supernatural, it is hard to deny that there is a lot of weird things going on in relation to these two assassinations. All right, with that all being said, we're going to turn our attention to kind of part one of what we sort of need to discuss here, and that is the kind of political aspects of Reconstruction and what Reconstruction in and of itself was about. Officially, we're going to consider the Reconstruction period to be about 12 years. Lincoln dies in spring of 1865, so we'll kind of count that as the beginning of Reconstruction because the war is over at that particular time. So we could sort of say Reconstruction is officially beginning. Ultimately, Reconstruction is going to end with a presidential election in 1877. So we're really kind of looking at about 12 years here. And so when we think about the idea of Reconstruction and what Reconstruction means and what it's about, there's really, for me, there's three things here that we kind of need to consider. So if we're talking about how do we put the country back together again in a way that works, any kind of real way that works, and ultimately our goal is to be one unified country back to the way that things were. I think that ultimately what you have to look at is you have to look at three pretty kind of key factors here. And so for me, Reconstruction is about these three things. It's about going through this process of rebuilding the country, putting the country back together the way that it was, obviously with some new things added in. And so I see these three things. I see a rebuilding of the country in terms of the South, the territory itself, an actual physical rebuilding of the South. You remember the war is almost exclusively fought in Southern territory, and there is a significant amount of damage. And so when the war is over and the South is part of the country again, we want the South to be productive because it's part of the country. And so the South needs to be put back together. We everything that we did, whether it was ripping down telegraph wires to stop the Confederate Army from communicating. Well, we want telegraph wires because we want the South to be able to communicate. Whether it's ripping up railroad tracks so that the Southern Army can't use the rail lines to get troops from one place to another. Well, we want those rail lines because we want people to be able to travel in the South. We want goods to be able to travel in the South. You think about all those, the factories in Atlanta burned to the ground. Well, we want those factories rebuilt. Think about all of the damage that Sherman did on his march to the sea. Just this insane amount of absolute destruction of the land. Well, we need to fix all that. We want the South to be productive. The bridges that we blew up so people couldn't get from one side of a river to the other, well, we want those bridges again. So there is an absolute physical rebuilding of the South. And of all the aspects of Reconstruction, this is the easiest. This is, give a guy a shovel and send him to work sort of stuff. The idea of being able to physically reconstruct the South is probably the easiest of the things that need to be done. The second is what I call rebuilding the nation in a political sort of way. Ultimately, we have a system that gives representation to each of the states. We have representatives, we have senators from all of the states. And ultimately, we're going to have one government that includes representation from all of the states. So we're going to want to be able to bring Southern representatives into the government in Washington, D.C. We're going to want Alabama to send their senators, their representatives. We're going to want Florida and North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia to be represented in our system. So those Southern representatives are going to come back into our government somehow, some way. And the whole idea is that we make laws that are good for all of the people in the country. So we have to have some thoughts in terms of the bias that Northerners have to have, the hatred that Northerners have to have toward Southerners, and the hatred that Southerners have to have toward Northerners. And at some point, we have to be able to put those guys all together and say, all right, here's the deal. We're making laws for all the people in America. How do we do that? How do we potentially, take loose constructionist Northerners and put them with state rights, strict constructionist Southerners, and come to some kind of, agreements between them about some of the things that we need to be able to do. So politically, there's a whole lot of work here. in front of us. And then the third aspect of Reconstruction for me is what I call the rebuilding of society. And I think about that in terms of teaching morality. And one of the biggest components here, if not the biggest component here, is the simple fact that we have to be a country that moves beyond racism. You know, the simple fact is that we are going to be a country that abolishes slavery. We're going to be a country that ultimately gives citizenship rights to African Americans by the 14th Amendment. We're going to be a country that eventually is going to give the right to vote to African American males, 21 and or 18 and older. Um, we're going to do those sort of things. I said 18, I meant 21 and older. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to move beyond the racism that had held us, for more than 200 years. So we got these we got these three big areas that need to be rebuilt, and the last of the three, in terms of society, that's something that I believe that we're still actually struggling with to this very day. Um, so um, so here's the deal. I'm going to kind of take you through, sort of the things that we did in terms of the country, and how eventually we get to, the official Reconstruction. Like, how do we do it as a government? So, in terms of the timeline, here's kind of the beginning. And one of the first things that's going to happen to the country is that we are not just going to go to the southern states and say, all right, come back into the country, like nothing happened. There's going to be rules for southern states. And one of the things that we're going to have to do is establish specifically what a southern state has to do in order to be accepted back into the country. So while we're thinking about the rules and beginning to establish what those rules are going to be, our first step is to kind of retake over the South here, and so our first step is to send the army into these southern states, and we're going to divide the southern states up into these military districts, and we're going to take all control away from the governors and the people governing the states in the South, and ultimately we're going to attempt to sort of begin to replace their governments. So basically, our first step is to divide the South into these 5 military districts, and then put the army in charge of the military districts. Now, the army's purpose is to be there in the South until the southern states meet the requirement to come back into the country. So ultimately, whatever plan that we have for southern states, there's going to be, a checklist of things that southern states have to be able to do before they can actually come back into the country. Until that happens, the army is going to basically be in charge. So the army is there to kind of oversee what it is that it's going to take southern states to come back into the country. The army is also there to protect the population. One of the things that we're going to have here is we're going to have a new population of free people in America. The slave population is going to become a free population. And as it becomes a free population, eventually it's going to gain the citizenship rights of a free population and the voting rights of a free population. Now, the white governors and the white power structure in the South, obviously, they're not going to be real happy with the idea of former slaves becoming citizens, and former slaves having voting rights. The right to vote is an incredibly powerful thing. And for the black population, through the vote, there is an opportunity for them to be represented in the American population. Whites in the South are not going to really want that. And so we have this new population of 3.5 million former slaves, and that population is going to have the rights of every other American. And so the Army is going to be there to ensure that as the black population acquires rights in America, that the black population is able to use those rights in America. And so the Army has kind of that dual function. They are overseeing all the things that are necessary for southern states to come back into the country. And they also serve a protective function for this new population of citizens, 3.5 million blacks who ultimately become citizens. So in the aftermath of the Civil War and the beginning notes of this idea of Reconstruction, we are going to see a couple of different groups that are going to kind of step to the forefront here. The first group that we're going to see are referred to as carpetbaggers. A carpetbagger, carpet bag by definition is basically a suitcase, and so carpetbaggers were people who were living in the North, and when the war was over, these people traveled to the South, and they went to the South because what they saw in the South was an opportunity. The South is a mess, and we basically took away the government. We fought wars over all this land, and there's abandoned land everywhere. And the carpetbagger, what they see is they see an opportunity here. They see the opportunity to gain some power, but even more important than that, the carpetbagger saw the ability to make some money, to establish themselves in cities and towns, and take control of abandoned land. And honestly, if you just went there and there wasn't anybody living on the land, you could just say it was yours, and then you could start to use that land in some kind of productive way. So the carpetbaggers are kind of the first class of people, and we're going to see them coming into the South. What they really want, the carpetbaggers, is they want money, and they see the chaos in the South, and they see an opportunity to potentially take advantage of this kind of chaos. And sometimes when I think about carpetbaggers, I think about what's going on with us in our country right now, this whole coronavirus and all the things that are going on. And I go back to some of the news reports about people who were buying up all the toilet paper and all of the hand sanitizer, and then charging people $1,000 a bottle for a bottle of hand sanitizer. And to me, that's kind of what a carpetbagger is like, because what they're doing is they're taking advantage of all of the anguish and war that went on over the last 4 years, and they're doing it just with the eye on profit. Like, how do I make money off of the misery of people? And those people charging $1,000 for hand sanitizer, that's what they're doing. They're taking advantage of the misery and suffering of the people in America right now, just to make a buck. So I think that's what carpetbaggers were mostly like. The second group of people were called scalawags. Scalawags are going to be a little bit different than carpetbaggers. Scalawags, firstly, they were people who already were Southerners. So they were people who were already living in the South. And for the most part, when the war started, scalawags were Confederates. They a lot of times served in the Confederate military. They were strong supporters of the idea of slavery and state rights and all the rest of that sort of stuff. However, scalawags, what happened to them is that they kind of clued in, about the middle of the war, when Vicksburg is falling and Gettysburg, Lee's getting beat back there. When those sort of things happened, scalawags were kind of the first of the Confederate populations to really understand that they weren't going to win. And so for a lot of scalawags, what they decided to do is to switch sides, to be on the winning side of this. If they stayed Confederates, they were not going to be on the winning side. They were the losers in all of this. But if they switched and they started supporting the Union Army, then potentially they're going to be seen as winners when this is all over. And so Scalawags did that. They kind of switched teams. And when we start to see 1864-ish, these Scalawags are sending letters to Lincoln, and they're being hospitable for Union troops that are making their way through their town, putting up Union armies, giving them a place to camp, giving them whatever food that they have, and basically just kind of turning their backs on their Confederate heritage and supporting the Union as much as they can. The thinking for the Scalawag is that, when the war does end, if we're here and we're supporting the Union and we live in the South, then Northern government is going to look to us for leadership, because they're going to look at us and they're going to say, look at these guys. These guys stayed with us. They supported us. They're on our side in the war. Let's put those guys in charge of Reconstruction. Let's put those guys in charge of rebuilding our cities and towns and things like that. So the Scalawags, they're going to be looking for power and influence. Carpetbaggers, they were about the money. Scalawags are more about the power. And, can they be mayors of cities and state representatives and U.S. congressmen and senators and governors, and grow to real positions of influence and power. And they do. I mean, most of the Scalawags are illiterate. They don't know how to read and write. Most of them are incredibly poor. And all of a sudden, when the war is over, Northerners are going to be looking at this population of people to take over leadership. And so the Scalawags are going to become prominent. They're going to become influential. But here's the thing about the Scalawags in particular, it doesn't change who they were. The Scalawags were, at their core, Southerners who believed in slavery, who believed in state rights, and just because they... That's my dog. Sugar's barking. Stop, Sugar. Just because they change sides doesn't mean that it's going to change the level of influence as far as they're concerned. So with Carpetbaggers and Scalawags in mind, we're going to kind of begin to sort of turn our attention toward the government's response to the idea of Reconstruction and what it was that ultimately we decided to do as far as Reconstruction plans go. We've talked a bit about Lincoln and what Lincoln would have done in terms of Reconstruction, and we get some hints, some public hints in terms of Lincoln. The quote here is from his second inaugural address when he got reelected in the 1864 election. In spring of 1865, with the war dying down, he gave his second inaugural in March of 1865, and in it he uses the phrase "with malice toward none, with charity for all," and he says, "In your hands, not mine, my dissatisfied countrymen." He basically says, "Here you go, Southerners. Here's what I'm thinking about you coming back into the country. Malice is hatred, and so it wasn't going to be about a significant amount of punishment for Southerners." He also says, "with charity for all." We know charity to be kindness, to be compassion and giving, and all the rest of that. So we get this significant idea that Lincoln's Reconstruction plan was going to be something that was going to be gentle. It was going to be something where Southerners were going to be able to pretty quickly come back into the country. In the end, there's only a couple of things that Lincoln thinks are necessary for Southern states to do to come back into the country. So we definitely get an idea that if Lincoln had been in charge of Reconstruction, it would have looked like, with malice toward none, with charity for all, that his plan would have been pretty simple for Southern states in terms of their ability to come back into the country. And that kind of proof of that, we get this from Jefferson Davis. Remember, he's the president of the Confederacy, the guy who had been going head to head against Lincoln throughout the course of the war, fighting for Southern ideals and Southern culture and the Southern way of life. And here's what he says. He says, next to the destruction of the Confederacy, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln is the darkest day the South has ever known. And so I think it's pretty easy for us to come to some conclusion from that. Davis is saying, what's really bad for Southerners outside of the fact that, our country, our Southern country is a mess, and we had all this war and all this death, and we lost. The biggest problem for us is that Lincoln is not there to lead us through the next step. So this is the guy he went to war against, This is the guy that Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy was fighting against. The ideas of Lincoln and the Union Army and all of it. And here's Jefferson Davis saying that Lincoln dying is the worst thing that could have happened to Southerners. Outside of how things look in our backyards and our farm fields on our land, the fact that Lincoln is gone is bad for Southerners. So think about that. This guy, Lincoln, who wouldn't acknowledge Southern states, wouldn't let them leave the country, was willing to fight a war, against them. Him dying was the worst thing that could happen to Southerners. So that's a pretty big deal. So, we can hypothesize, we can surmise that, Lincoln Reconstruction would have been something that wouldn't have taken a long period of time. It wouldn't have created a significant amount of more hostility. It would have been something that could have been worked through. So what we know ultimately that Lincoln had some specific ideas about Reconstruction. We also know that when Lincoln dies, that we're not going to see Lincoln Reconstruction. In the end, ultimately, we have kind of four different ways that Reconstruction can go from a political perspective. The first is Lincoln's way. Lincoln's actual plan was pretty simple. Lincoln basically wanted two things to happen. Lincoln wanted 10% of the Southern population in any given state to sign loyalty to the United States. So Lincoln's Reconstruction plan basically said 1 out of 10 Southerners who was of voting age, which meant male men over the age of 21, 10%, 1 out of 10, basically signs a pledge, loyalty card, saying that they're loyal to the government, to the United States, to the Constitution of the United States. When you get that 10% and you agree to abolish slavery in your state, then you can come back into the country. So that's it. All you got to do is sign the loyalty oath to the country and get rid of slavery, and you can come back into the country. So that was Lincoln's plan, and we know in the end that's not going to happen because Lincoln dies. So instead, we end up with some other plans that increasingly are more and more kind of geared toward punishment of Southern states. Like, for instance, we have a plan called the Wade-Davis plan. The Wade-Davis plan basically, same thing about slavery. You had to get rid of slavery. But the Wade-Davis plan said that 50% uh, one out of two Southern men, 21 and older, had to agree to sign loyalty oaths. The Wade Davis plan is going to actually add a little more punishment in that in Wade Davis it says that if you fought in the war and you were a Confederate soldier fighting in the war or a Confederate official, like anybody in the government and the Confederacy, you could no longer vote or hold public office. So Wade Davis is gonna get mean, and it's gonna kind of strike at sort of the heart of the Southerners who fought the war. So there's more punishment associated with Wade Davis, and so that becomes an option. Wade Davis, 50% sign loyalty, abolish slavery in your state, and you also had to not let Confederate officials or soldiers vote or hold public office for the rest of their lives. So there's much more punishment in that. President Johnson, when he becomes president, he's going to have his own plan. Johnson, in terms of his ideas are pretty Lincoln-like. But Johnson, in the end, is going to kind of be seen as Southern sympathizer. Wade Davis comes out before President Johnson's official plan. And so when Johnson offers his Reconstruction plan, like Lincoln, it said, 13th Amendment, abolish slavery. It also said that a majority of white males had to swear loyalty. But it said if you were a Confederate official, like the president of the Confederacy, like Jefferson Davis, or you had fought in the war, then there was no punishment for you. So it basically peeled away the Wade Davis restrictions. And as soon as he did that, then Johnson was kind of seen as being a Southern sympathizer. So instead of being a president who comes out against Southerners, he kind of leaves that whole idea that, Southern officials can come back into the government, they can do their part, and, all the rest of that. And so Northerners kind of begin to turn on him. And as they turn on him, the idea of making punishment even more a part of Reconstruction becomes pretty clear. And so ultimately, we're going to get the fourth plan, the Radical Republican Reconstruction Plan. And this is basically the one that ultimately we decided on. Radical Reconstruction is going to be punishment for Southerners. It basically says that Southern states have to get rid of their state constitutions, that they're going to have to start from scratch and rewrite their constitutions all over again. It says that they have to give citizenship rights, which is the 14th Amendment, to the African American populations. It says that they have to give the right to vote to African American populations, and that a Southern state cannot come back into the country unless it's done those things. So the radical plan becomes the plan that we ultimately use. And so we're going to see kind of a teaming up between the Wade Davis Republicans, the moderate Republicans, and the radical Republicans. And once we start to see that, this is where things kind of go sideways for President Johnson, and we really start to see them turning against him. What kind of hooks the radicals and the moderates together is some of the positions that Johnson takes, and these positions are positions that show that he is not in favor of the Northern agenda. Like, he is more supportive of Southerners than he is of Northerners. There's a couple of three things specifically that Johnson is going to come out publicly against. One of those is the Freedmen Bureau Bill. The Freedmen Bureau Bill was a bill that was sponsored by some moderate Republicans, and the goal of the Freedmen Bureau was to get help to this new black population in the South. The whole thing about the Freedmen Bureau Bill was that it was intended to, kind of pull up some of these poor people in the South. The biggest population of poor people in the South was the black population. It's a population that is just coming out of slavery. It's a population that is going to need government help. And so the Freedmen Bureau was about that. It was about helping those populations. In the end, the Freedmen Bureau was going to build schools. It was going to provide immediate need sort of things like rent money, like food, like heating oil in the winter. It was going to be things that was going to have an immediate impact in terms of helping the black population. President Johnson ultimately vetoed the Freedmen Bureau bill, said no. Now, eventually, the radical and the moderate Republicans are going to get together and override that veto, but Johnson's position in terms of the veto makes it pretty clear where he is. He also vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was a bill designed to provide sameness of rights. This is before the amendment that gave citizenship and the right to vote. The Civil Rights Act was going to kind of provide at a federal level some of those sameness of rights without going through the amendment process, and Jackson vetoed that. Jackson also actively campaigned against passage of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the citizenship amendment. It's the amendment that gives citizenship rights to anyone who is born in the United States. It also provides them with equal protection under the law. So, sameness of rights, skin color doesn't matter, according to the 14th Amendment. President Johnson is going to be against that. So ultimately, these are the things that are going to bring the radicals and the moderates together against President Johnson. So a little bit about Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is President 17. He is the president who takes over after Lincoln. There's little controversy with Johnson in that Johnson is a Southerner, and he is not the same political party as Lincoln. When Lincoln first ran for president in 1860, his vice president was a guy named Hannibal Hamlin. Hannibal Hamlin was from Maine, and he was Lincoln's vice president for Lincoln's first term in office. So from the election of 1860 through 1864, Hannibal Hamlin was vice president. When Lincoln ran for re-election, strategically, he sought out a Southerner who potentially he thought he could maybe use to get some votes from some Southern states. Now, Johnson was the former governor of Tennessee, and he had spoken out against Tennessee joining the Confederacy. So he was kind of one of these guys on the fence, and he did not support Tennessee leaving the Union. And so Lincoln thought that potentially he could use that in terms of his election. So he got rid of Hamlin, and he brought Johnson onto the ticket. So Johnson was a Southerner, also a Democrat, and Lincoln was a Republican. So this is a guy from a different political party. Obviously, Lincoln, wasn't thinking, I'm going to get shot at the beginning of my second term, and this guy's going to be president. But ultimately, that's exactly what happened. Now, when Johnson comes to the presidency as a Southerner and as a Democrat and a slave owner, which he was, Northerners are not going to like that. And those kind of traits are not the things that they're going to get behind. Most of the Northerners are Republican. Most of the Northerners anti-slave. And so, Johnson doesn't really fit in, and they don't trust him from the beginning. So eventually, when we get to this radical Reconstruction and we see where Johnson's heart really is, vetoing the Freedmen Bureau bill and vetoing the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and campaigning against the passage of the 14th Amendment, when we start to see those things and we start to know exactly who this Andrew Johnson guy is, Northerners, especially the Northern Republicans, they don't want him to be president. And so they start to look for potential ways to get past him. Overriding a veto is one thing, but ultimately what they're going to think is that we need to, get rid of this guy altogether. And so what we know historically is that if you want to get a president out of office, impeachment is the legal way to remove a president from office. If you can get them impeached and you can get them to be found guilty, then potentially you can get them out of office. And that's what they're going to do with Johnson. Johnson is going to get impeached, and they're going to try to remove him from office. So the Republicans in the Congress, the radical Republicans, they're going to basically say that Johnson, his policies are not strict enough. There's not enough punishment for Southerners, and they want radical Reconstruction. They want this kind of painful Reconstruction that's going to be difficult for Southerners. They want them to get rid of their state governments, to rewrite their state constitutions, to approve citizenship rights, to approve the right to vote. They want all that stuff done. And Johnson is kind of standing in their way of being able to do those things. So ultimately what the radicals are going to say is we need to get rid of this guy. And they're going to attempt to do it through the legal means of impeachment. When it's all said and done, there are two things that President Johnson does that are technically violations of the law. The Constitution says that you can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, but it doesn't say what a high crime and misdemeanor is. We don't know. So the Congress ultimately gets to make that decision of if it is a high crime and misdemeanor. The House does it through impeachment. The Senate does it through trial. So ultimately, there's going to be two things, because the truth is with President Johnson, when you go back to his background, what you don't find is a lot of illegal activity. So they can't go back into his past and dredge up some bad things. So they kind of have to look right in front of them and see if they can find some illegal stuff in front of them. Ultimately, they come up with two things. One thing is called the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act is basically a law that says that a president cannot fire a member of his cabinet without the approval of the Senate. The Tenure of Office Act goes all the way back to 1839. It is not something that we have in today's law, but it was something that we had in the law in the 1860s. And so one thing that's going to happen with Johnson is that a lot of his cabinet officials are kind of holdovers from the Lincoln administration. So a lot of guys in his cabinet are guys that were cabinet secretaries for Lincoln. And they're not going to like Johnson so much either. At one point, his Secretary of War, a guy named Edwin Stanton, he's going to become very public in terms of the fact that he does not like Johnson and things Johnson is doing. And so President Johnson is going to fire the Secretary of War. So he's going to fire Edwin Stanton and basically say, you know what, can't talk like that against me and be in my cabinet. And so he fires him. That technically is against the law. The law says you can't fire a cabinet secretary without the approval of the Senate. He did that. So that is technically against the law. Is it a high crime? Not so sure it's a high crime. But he did it. And so Secretary of War Stanton, when he finds out that he is fired, Secretary of War Stanton actually refuses to leave his office. Literally refuses to leave his office. He barricades himself in his office and he won't come out. So President Johnson calls the Army, and the Army comes over and escorts the Secretary of War out of his office. So they literally go into his office and take him out. Now, that is illegal. The president is not allowed to use the military for his own purposes. Now, President Johnson could have called the police, but he didn't. He called the Army. And the president can't do that. So the president isn't allowed to use the military for those purposes. So when the Army came in and got Secretary of War Stanton out, that is a violation of the law. Is it a high crime? I don't know. So ultimately, he's going to get impeached on those two things: violating the tenure of office and using the military for his own purposes. The way impeachment works, the House of Representatives impeaches. Impeach means that they're going to accuse him of committing those two crimes. And then President Johnson is going to have a trial. The trial occurs in the United States Senate, and you need a 2/3 majority of senators to agree that the president is not only guilty, but that what he did rises to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. And so President Johnson is going to become our first impeached president. We also know that through the course of time, Bill Clinton became an impeached president and Donald Trump became an impeached president. So we have had 3 officially impeached presidents. President Johnson will have a trial in the Senate, and in his trial, he will be found not guilty. So, just like in Bill Clinton's trial, just like in Donald Trump's trial, both of those guys were found not guilty. President Johnson, too, was found not guilty. Now, what that means is that even though he was impeached, he gets to continue to be president. So President Johnson will continue to be president for the rest of his time in office. So he is president through 1868. On the last slide, it said the dead dog of the White House, because that's what President Johnson became. They started referring to him as the dead dog because even though he was still president, he had lost a significant amount of power by being impeached. And ultimately, Johnson's vetoes didn't matter. Nothing mattered with him. It was just a matter of time. Obviously, he's not going to get reelected. And so in 1868, Johnson doesn't get reelected president. We actually choose a new president. In 1868, we elect Ulysses S. Grant. Remember him from the Civil War? He's going to become our new president in 1868. Okay, so this is kind of part 1. I've got some reading thing for you to do and some questions for you to answer. So go back to Google Classroom and take a look at that assignment. There are questions and then a place for you to write your answers. Make sure that you have that done before you show up for our next class. Part 2 of Reconstruction, we're gonna talk about the impact of Reconstruction. We're going to talk about what it means for all the people in America when we officially end this whole Reconstruction sort of period. And the biggest population of concern at the end of Reconstruction is the new free population. So we're going to be looking a lot at how the end of Reconstruction impacts the African American population in our country, and what, if anything, we did right, and all of the things that we definitely did wrong in terms of post-Reconstruction America.